Welcome back to the second part of this episode, and I've just finished listening. What a joy! I think I've talked about themes in this episode that I've not really covered in any other episode about our shared experience of working in social work or community work and inequality and systemic challenges that impact so many people. And I just wrote down a quote from Jen here in this podcast episode, but just to share again, because it feels so validating but sad in lots of ways. So many roles in social work are highly skilled, but also come with a high risk of vicarious trauma and burnout. And we acknowledge within that part of the episode that there is so many jobs like that in society where it demands so much energy, time, mental, emotional, psychological energy, and it doesn't come with support. And we touch on the gifts of becoming a counsellor for us and becoming a business owner within that role, where we're able to have agency and autonomy in the role and support, because counselling comes with built-in support that isn't the norm in many other fields. That the idea of supervision and personal counselling is the foundation of being a counsellor. I remember how different and interesting that was for me when I first learned that that was just a part of being a counsellor, is that we are expected to have supervision, and that is support for the client work that we do. But then we also have personal counselling to explore things that we're processing and exploring within ourselves, historically, in the moment, presently, and anything in between. And I really, really appreciated hearing Jen's experience and being able to share some of my own. It's honest and raw. And some of the things that I was sharing, I was working out in the moment. And that's the gift of these podcast episodes, is we're able to work things out together, make sense of each other's experience, and think about what we believe about those things, about those topics. So I'm really, really chuffed that we got to talk about these themes, and they continue to be important in my life. And I'm really excited to hear any thoughts about this episode and how it landed for you, what you think, what you feel. And like I mentioned in part one, share that with Jen if you can. And it's also totally okay to be a silent listener too. I am a silent listener on many a podcast. But if you do have any thoughts or questions on that, please feel free to get in touch. Okay, I hope you enjoy. Bye.
You get to be all of you, and I think that's I don't know if you find this with I suppose the person-centered foundation. I put a caveat on this, is that I am person-centered deeply. I deeply believe in it, but I do think that there are some things when we're working in an accessible way that we need to be open to doing, that aren't traditionally person-centered, but that make our practice neuroaffirming, um, or aware of the kind of social conditions. There's a level of directivity involved in that doesn't fall under the classical person-centered approach. But yeah, I think the person-centeredness offers space for folk to explore their whole selves in all of these kind of identities that we've spoken about, or these kind of ways of being. And I suppose it makes me sad that person-centeredness is often co-opted as a technique and then applied to people, and then their experience of person-centeredness when they actually come to a person-centered psychotherapist is very, very different than the perception of it beforehand. Yeah. Or that they've already been through. This is the most common experience that I hear of, is like having gone to therapy and like experiencing therapeutic harm, and that therapeutic harm being rooted in this idea that you've got a set number of sessions. This is how you need to improve during those sessions. There's a number of outcomes that you need to meet, and also these are the things we'll diagnose you with along the way. And now off you go, having no sense made of the wholeness of our inner world from navigating that process. Yeah. So yeah, I've got a lot of kind of complicated feelings about very much free provision of services is essential to a well-functioning society, services that offer care services. But at the same time, I think that the services that are currently offered in the UK and Ireland in terms of mental health provision, the freely available services, are doing more harm than they're offering
Yeah.
therapeutic growth or healing for folk.
How sad is that to acknowledge too? And in some ways, it takes me to, I wanted to quickly share two things on what you shared. One, let's talk a wee bit more about person-centered and some of the sometimes prejudice or stigma that comes up with even hearing that, with especially with therapists that don't live in that approach. Live in, yeah, I guess it does feel like living in, yeah. But then another part of it is this sense of free services. So my roots are community education and youth work. Started out when I first left school working in a nursing home, and that was because just to share, because we're first meeting, so there's so many things that we're learning about each other through this process. By the way, before I share, how are you doing? How are you feeling?
Yeah, good. Yeah, I was actually just thinking there, like, wow, the time feels like it's flying by. I'm really enjoying the conversation. I don't know if you're feeling the same.
Yeah, I really am. It's so nice. And there's so many things that I'm sure we could continually talk about. Yeah, so first left school and I really knew that I wanted to work with people. I just didn't know how to express that or what. I also felt like there wasn't anything really matching that in my direct experience growing up. Growing up in quite an impoverished area, just me and my mum, and I didn't see that around me, but I had a really strong relationship with my gran, and I thought, well, I'd love to work with older people. That is just the place I want to be, hearing stories, hearing about their life, all the things that come with that. And I almost romanticized what that would feel like and be like. It was the opposite of that. And my first placement experience was deeply painful and emotionally so unanchoring and deeply sad to be involved in that system and see it play out and know that actually the people that were in it weren't in control of it. You know, I went into it thinking I'd have this really lovely way of connecting, and it was then just kind of daily needs being met, and maybe there's a wee bit room for creativity and connection, but not fully. So then I found community education and youth work, and talking about free services, it really allowed me to see the power of having community work and youth work, and then sometimes the challenges within it, and funding cuts and all the things that are ongoing and have actually been ongoing since I started youth work, but seem to be at a kind of pivotal peak right now. But it's almost always been a conversation, noticing funds being cut and the challenges around that. And then also, like you said, not trusting that when someone's met with those services that they're going to get a service that is going to be nurturing, nourishing, grounding, connecting, all those things that as an advocate for youth work, community work, therapy, I would think, oh, absolutely go. And now I'm beginning to think I've been a wee bit naive with my own experience and the people around me thinking it's all okay, you know, that it's going to be a good place. And then knowing that actually it can be harmful. I feel like I almost didn't want, it wasn't even being naive. I almost didn't want to see it. I was like, I have to believe there's some places that are just soft places to land. And it was almost trying to kind of believe that. And then I think that around that conversation, there's not enough space for acknowledgement of, that's why I brought up community education. The very first lecture that we had at Edinburgh Uni, whole journey to get to that place of going through college and all these things to finally get to uni and really enjoy parts of it, but also learn that there was this real understanding that I'd first heard in the class around what is individual issues and what are societal issues. So the reason I want to bring that up is because it's connected with these kind of free mental health services, is it encourages us as the service user. I don't even like that word at all, but imagine as the person who's engaging with those services, it encourages us to see it's us that's the issue. And I think that is such a problem, although it can be empowering and take us on a journey. I think that if we ignore societal systems, inequality, all the things that come with that, I think it can create a lot of shame, guilt, and all the things that can kind of keep us stuck. You can already bring in the problems, the challenges that you're experiencing, and then you've got new layers of feeling responsible for them. And it doesn't
Mm.
allow that nuance of acknowledging there might be things that we can work through and work on, whilst
Mm.
also acknowledging the systemic inequality that we've lived in or have grown up in. So I think that is a conversation I'm actively always in my mind, and why I'm
Mm.
so grateful for having that as my early experience of the world of being in youth work, being in community work, and seeing the way family systems work and inequality plays out. And I have personal experience of that, but I have real deep professional experience of inequality and how it plays out. And I think free services in some ways are, it's not all of them, and I can't generalize in that way, but sometimes
Mm.
when the funding is cut, we're limited with some of the spaces that still exist. Um,
Yeah.
a lot of stuff in there. I was trying to connect it with lots of things, but hopefully it's not too overwhelming to share all of that.
No, because I guess I've worked in charities since I moved to Scotland. So for the last up until I stopped working in the third sector just in February of this year. So it was
Mm.
like 11 years, and similar, like different roles in the sense I started working out in substance use, so working with folk who were living with hepatitis C and were injecting either currently or previously and trying to get them to treatment. And then I moved into sexual health and HIV. I burnt out from working directly because it's such an unsupported um, a role that you really need. Like so many roles in social care are highly skilled, but also come with a very high risk of vicarious trauma or burnout. And back then, like funding was a bit better. It was like what 2013, I guess, was when I started working in the substance use sector. And funding cuts were beginning at that point, but I suppose that was, what was that, maybe 2 years into a conservative UK. I know obviously the Scottish government is separate, but the funding being handed down. Um, and then moving into sexual health and HIV, I started more working in kind of engagement work and then laterally in like research. And that was amazing. I loved the research because it was about participatory action research. So very much resourcing people to carry out research, but then feeling like also actually people are learning skills that they can use to resource themselves more broadly in life. So rather than this, I'm doing this thing to you, or I'm doing this with you. So
Mm.
kind of I suppose a shift, and that was because the role I was in, I was able to make that change. I had that at that point. I'd worked to the point where I had that, I suppose, power to make those changes in how we work. But throughout that time, and I became increasingly, um, I suppose maybe jaded working in the third sector because I was looking around at just so many people who, the people providing these lifelines who were living with complex trauma
Yeah.
themselves, being exploited by
Yeah.
the idea of the caregiver, being underpaid, that being a systemic issue throughout the sector, which I'm sure you'll be aware of or have experienced if you've worked in it. I mean, if you can't work in it without experiencing that,
Yeah.
unless you, I suppose, fly in as a management role or something.
Yeah.
And and then also watching the structures that are set up to support people providing services really not being trauma informed, but being termed trauma informed. So the difference between the, I suppose, action and language being so big that the sector itself has this wonderful language to articulate itself, but that's not as quickly translated into the reality of how staff are treated, how people accessing services are treated. And it felt really incongruent.
Mm.
And the more, so I started training as a therapist while I was, still working in the sector because it's so expensive to train
Me
as a
too.
therapist. It's like you
Yeah.
just have to bankrupt yourself emotionally and financially to
And
do it.
financially. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Um, I like the mute because of the sensory. Um,
Mm.
And during that time, prior to that, I began going to therapy, like person-centered therapy as a
Mm.
client. So I'd already I had been coming, I had started coming into myself a lot more over that time. But then as I started training, I started really translating that practice into, like you said, it was living in. It's a way of being. It's not a
Yeah.
technique that I'm applying. It's a coming into who I am, and who I
Yeah.
am is I'm guided by values of fairness and I suppose advocacy.
Hmm.
Um, and I stopped, I suppose, colluding in the way that I was as a person, in the sense that I stopped being like, well, this is how it is, so I'll say nothing. Or and as I became more myself and more congruent and more, I suppose, confident in that,
Yeah.
the sector no longer welcome. I felt no longer welcome in the sector because it because it's so under resourced. Like
Yeah.
it's a kind of a domino effect. The sector is under resourced, but then the sector demands exploitation of those who are within it, and then that exploitation means that the people who the sector is there, the function of the sector is there to resource, no longer resources, but
Yeah.
often punishes people who are accessing at the endpoint at the services. And I think there's, I remember reading Poverty Safari by Darren McGarvey. Now, there's lots of places that my perspectives and his perspectives, we don't align. But there are some areas where I think that he has a very legitimate critique of the use of resources in society. And I think that
Yeah.
the charity sector is one of those areas where legitimately there is the question of, if all of those resources were directed to communities and they were trusted
Yeah.
and facilitated to use those resources without them being filtered, there might be a better way. And I think we did see some of that happening in COVID, where when funding was routed, and it came via charities. There was a function for the third sector within that, but the function wasn't as a gatekeeper; it was a facilitator. So the power dynamic was different, and that there was a lot of family families who felt that that was much better because they were getting direct funds now via the third sector. And then when that changed after COVID, there was, I it kind of went back to what the learning that was found in COVID was lost again.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm saying is that I think that person centered, it's hard because do I want to be offering this way of being through a private practice, and therefore there's a barrier to the way I practice
Mm.
in finances? No,
Mm.
that's not how I would like to be practicing in a service, in a service that is funded by the government or funded in the third sector, where I can offer this way of working or way of being and processing life in that way. That's not possible. That openness, or that there's a rigidity, like we said earlier, like demanded by the way things are set up right now, and I can't participate in that any longer because it doesn't feel congruent to me, and it
Yeah.
demands that I suppose carceral approaches to how we work, which don't they feel oppressive, and it just doesn't, again, it doesn't sit right with me. So
Yeah.
it's I have a I have a lot of thoughts on the impact of, well, just this, I guess, the sadness, because there's just so many people who are trying to do their best in
Yeah.
different ways. Do
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like, that's what it comes down to. Like, care is as important infrastructure to the way society functions as transport is. Not
Yeah.
that it's the same thing, but it's just as, if not more important.
Right.
And yet that infrastructure has degraded over the years, and it has become an exploitative system for
Yeah.
everyone who is trying to access it.
How
Um,
sad. There is so much
yeah,
grief and sadness within that. And in some ways, that kind of acknowledgement of care being a fundamental need.
And there's lots of cross paths with community education and social work. One being that community education is more informal, and that's what Dharma Garvey talks about, how and that really apt name, poverty safari, of people going in and parachuting into communities. And the thread that I could hear from what you're saying is there's no agency and there's no congruence. So like, where's the movement to find what works for them and suits their needs, and all these kind of challenges that ComEd talks about tons. And sounds like we've been on kind of similar paths in terms of, I started as a voluntary youth worker in my local community centre and moved right up to working with an organisation that leads youth work, and acknowledging the research and acknowledging what informs the whole or kind of systems in Scotland in terms of community work and community education. And I guess there was a real grief and loss for me coming up when I had to leave. Like there was like a part of my identity that I had to reshift, and all the people I'd worked with over the years going, we're losing another youth worker to something else. You know, that there is a sense of like, they've pushed past capacity so many times, and during COVID worked with really painful things. And there's so much at capacity feeling throughout. You know, there's always like, I'm at capacity here, I'm overwhelmed, and not listening to that coming up because of many different reasons, feeling responsible, feeling like actually we highlight that there's other opportunities for people and you're not responsible. And that's the thing I had to unlearn from childhood, this feeling of being responsible. But actually the kind of culture within some of the work that I was doing, I was responsible. If I wasn't there, young people had no other points of care, contact, feeling seen, being understood. So it really pushed that in conflict of not wanting to feel responsible and letting go of that, and allowing me to step back and have more of an equal dynamic in relationships, but actually acknowledging there isn't anything else, you know. And so I had to leave some jobs and go, I'm not sure that this young person will still engage in this therapeutic service that we're offering. And finding out later on down the line that that's what happened, because the relationship was so integral to the trust and the safety and all the things that come with it, that ended up ending for them and for me. And it was so painful hearing other people say that too. It's just, it is really painful to acknowledge. And it sounds like social work has a similar dynamic to community work in that way. And yeah, it brings up a lot of sadness for me, because there's a loss of community in all of those forms for people, and a loss of relying on that service, you know, a loss of like belief in that, you know. And last wee thing on that I was so amazed coming into therapy that there was supervision and other integral parts of looking after ourselves that just does not exist. You know, that this sense of like, we need to go to the very core of who we are in order to show up for clients or for the people we work with. That just it doesn't form a part of the learning. And I've done both. I've learned to become a counsellor and learned to become a community worker. And there wasn't that emphasis on meeting yourself at depth.
No.
And then also knowing that that's an ongoing process, that you have supervision, you have peer supervision, you have people in your community that you can lean on that get how hard the work is. I think that sometimes in certain clusters of community work, there is almost like, don't complain, don't let things come up, that it's like, don't acknowledge what's coming up, just keep going. And there's a sense of momentum that doesn't allow you to kind of take pause and come up for breath. Because if you do, you're going to be like, actually, I need to leave because this is too much. And then you lose people.
Yeah. Right? And I think it's even, there's also, if I stop and I complain, well, is this person going to focus on my funding? Or are they going to focus on this other part? So the competition that is inherent in the sector now it's also like the internalization of capitalism in the charity sector. It totally removes any sense of, there is no psychological safety. You might experience psychological safety through a good manager, or maybe you're in a good organization, but that is totally counteracted by the wider sense of structural psychological lack of safety. So there's no, you can resource to survive it, but there's no sense of thriving. And it's a really sad, it's a sad way for, I suppose, so much kindness. I think that's what it is that there's so much kindness and creativity and commitment and passion from so many people within the sector, and it is just slowly drained. And I think exactly, like, I moved to the point where I moved into policy, and I was good at policy, but it's just I felt so much anger at how, when I got to the point where it was like, I think what I did was I started like, so I was in social care rather than social work, but I literally started as a support worker. I worked in research, communication, engagement. Then I finally got to the point of policy. So it was constantly, okay, I'm trying this. This isn't, I see that there's problems here. Maybe I can change this. Okay, I'm going to go forward. I try this next thing. Okay, no, comms in particular drained my whole inner self. That was like, I think that probably is just that kind of job doesn't suit me in general. And then I got to the last point in that journey was policy. And I was like, surely I can, I was working on the National Care Service, and I was like, this is going to be a huge structural change. Like, there's so much potential from the National Care Service. Like, this can be Scotland's, it can be something that Scotland can be truly, deeply proud of changing. Like the NHS, but for social care. This is a genuinely meaningful thing. And then I got to know the inner workings of just how much inner poor, I would say, relational conflicts between people in power affect the outcome of structural change. And that was just, I felt so much anger. And I just was angry all the time. And I was like, right, I have to make a decision here. Do I continue on? And again, the people that I was working with were kind, committed people, and it's no reflection on them. It is the system that we were navigating. And I suppose that's what I caveat, is that this isn't me pointing fingers at individual people. This is a structural criticism. But then I got to it and I was like, I need to go in, I'm going to try full-time private practice, because I was working half-time as a therapist and half-time as a policy officer. And I was like, this is not good for like my brain or body.
There's so many things. I'd love to listen back to what you said around relational conflict impacts kind of systemic change. And I think, have you ever heard of that book, Hiding in Plain Sight? It's by a person called Carol Craig. She talks a lot about trauma in Scotland and a lot of how it's just hiding there. It's like we can see it everywhere. Alcoholism, conflict in relationships, all the things that we can see but are pushed away or navigated with a kind of shame or just even the space to acknowledge it, right? And like you said, so much kindness. That's why it was so painful to leave. It's like being, and I can already, from my experience of you today, acknowledge that you're a sensitive being. And I experience the world through that lens so much. And so I could have so much empathy and understanding for the people I'm working with, and also see all their pain, which was just like so exhausting, because a big part of training to become a counselor was finding empathy with boundaries for me, because I was almost like just flowing out of my body all the time, and it was so exhausting. And I didn't realize I could have in some ways some boundaries with that. And it was almost like coming home to myself allowed me to have some more boundaries with that. So being in that work, being highly sensitive, being overwhelmed, seeing all the systemic issues, feeling almost like the relationships I was building were having an impact, and feeling that at my core. So that was keeping me going. Being ingrained in those kind of trusting, safe relationships was fueling that sense of responsibility. Like, I know I'm making a wee difference, like that sense of tend to the garden you can touch. Have you ever heard of that? I really feel that in my body. Growing up, how I grew up, there was almost like this sense of, I need to commit to the young people who had experienced some similar lives to me. So growing up in a kind of working class environment where you need safe places to land, you need safe people, you need lighthouses. And I felt that responsibility so heavily that I think that's what kept me going, alongside, like you described, the kind people. And also you can see what they're trying to work towards. Like, you can see what here or social work is trying to work towards. You can see the aims, and what some of it is really touching that, and then other times it's just not. So I think, like you said, and I think it's a really nice place to kind of go towards an ending, is that what we don't work on internally will show up in everything. And so if as a culture, we are not acknowledging relational conflict, relational pain, internal conflict, internal pain, incongruence, not being able to show up as we are, then it's going to create these kind of echoes of imbalance and pain and all the things that come alongside that. And I think the process of becoming a counselor has been so meaningful and so deeply healing. And in all the ways internally, it's been that for me, but it actively continues to be that because I'm creating meaningful relationships and meeting people at depth. And it's almost like the whole process of becoming a counselor, I came home to myself. But then that process is actively ongoing in the work that I do. It's like a parallel thing. The process of learning was such a gift. And I felt so much more grounded in my body and in myself and connected with myself. But then the joy of the work, and that's why I know it really fits me, is that it's an ongoing thing. Like it doesn't mean that it's not tiring, or sometimes I lay on the ground and just put on Joni Mitchell and have a wee cry. Like that happens. That happens. But the process of being able to make it more autonomous to me, like online, outdoors, acknowledge my sensory stuff, acknowledge so many things about myself and show up in relationship with others. It was like all the things that were barriers to that in youth work and community work fell away when I could have my own private practice. And similar to you, I was balancing both very well. And half my week was in this space of like, was me, some relationships was fully me, but some of it was just not. And I didn't have any agency over it. And sometimes I was sensory overwhelmed and I couldn't meet the needs that I can for myself in this work. So it meets all the kind of needs of individual stuff for me, being creative as well. I love it. I love social media for that reason, because I love being creative and showing my ideas in a kind of creative way. Conversations like this, where we're just able to connect and be open together and hopefully now reconnect. It's like there's so many arms to it that I've just felt such joy with. And I think I'd love to hear your experience of that to end, and also, I guess, to share around the person-centered approach, just to end on my experience, is that no client that I've worked with looks the same. And that's what's so joyful for me, is that that's what highlights congruence. There might be some themes. In fact, I actually think that if you got all the clients I worked with in a room, it would be a whole fun party, because they have so many similarities between them, although deep differences. There are certain people that are drawn to you for certain reasons. But the work that we've done together has been so unique to them. And I think that's why the person-centered counselling approach was always kind of calling me, because it left room for finding out your own space, and it didn't have to follow this kind of linear path. It could just follow the person. Yeah, that's all I wanted to share on that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I mean, it's the same as like that openness. The person-centered approach is open. It reflects you, and you just get to find out who you are. But I also think there's an anti-authoritarian element. I don't like being told what to do. And a lot of the people like that I work with also don't want to be told what to do. Or maybe it's part of the process to explore what it means to direct your own life and your own self and have that agency, that kind of, that autonomy in how you meet yourself and the world around you. So I think that's the person-centered approach. I completely agree. I have never taken care of myself so well since, like, I was trying before when I was in that other job, but now, like, I care for myself in a way that is both to care for me, because I deserve care. We all deserve to care for ourselves as just humans, but also because the better I care for myself, the more space I have to care for myself, the more I can show up. So it's both of those things. It's which I feel like I'm always saying. I'm like, it's both. It's not either or. It's not either or. And I think that being in private practice has offered that. Also noticed when you said about the social media. So what I noticed when I was working in comms before, I hated it because it was so incongruent. I had to write in a particular tone of voice. I had to say things in a certain way. Again, language, back to that same point. Like there was words that had to be used that just didn't feel right. They didn't connect with me, my own, I suppose, ethics. Whereas now, now that I found my groove with my social media, took a little bit of time to figure out what felt congruent to share, what felt good. I kind of just share stuff that I'm interested in, things I'm thinking about, and it seems to connect with people I'm working with, and people I spoke to are connected to my Instagram, which is where I kind of mostly post. So that's made it really enjoyable because now it's just like creative expression of like my inner ponderings and the things that I'm looking at when I'm walking my dog, which is usually greenery. So it's nice, which I've also found. I know that you were kind of really connected to that side of like the natural, I suppose, world, but I've also found I'm looking for beauty in a way that has a function, but also is just like more focused on looking for lovely things as I'm walking. So I feel like I've become more intentional in a really unexpected way, because part of it is to put background videos on my ponderings. But it is the case that I now I'm like notice when I'm out walking, Sheeta, my dog, who's gazing at me just now, but it's I'm noticing things that are going on, and I'm also then okay, I'll put my thoughts on that. So yeah, I think person-centered approach, beautiful approach. I think there's some areas that we have our lived experience, and that's really important to bring in, but that we also need to fortify that with learning, and not assuming that our lived experience is anyone else's experience, but it's a jumping off point, and then we become competent. So I think in the areas I work in with like kink and non-monogamy and queerness, it's like, yes, I have experiences that align within those, but those are my experiences, and now I must do the ongoing work to ensure that I have the knowledge to practice, because there's a difference between my practice and my lived experience.
Right.
So I think that's why it's really lovely that people do come to me who we do have sharedness, but that sharedness is some sharedness with that maybe offers that soft place to jump from, rather than it being like a taking from the folk I work with, their experience.
Yes.
So yeah, I think I really love talking to you, because
me too.
You connect to person-centeredness, and I really loved hearing about your experience of the third sector as well. That feels, I didn't realize that was part of like your kind of history to now. So yeah, it was really lovely. I suppose actually I haven't really had a chance to process that in this way from the perspective of therapists. So that's just been really lovely to hear. Lovely, also hard in the sense of like it's not. There was nice experiences, but there was also hard experiences in there. But I just felt connected to it, I guess.
Yeah. And it's such a beautiful way to bring everything together, I feel, in what you've just shared, because I think it links in with everything that we've talked about. There's so many themes that connect all together in some ways, and I feel we could definitely do this again. I mean, there's so many things, even just as a kind of informal, non-recorded way of, I'd love to talk a wee bit more about Irish and Scottish kind of roots, and how childhood experiences, shame, all the things that I've seen you explore on Instagram. I think there's a lot of Scottishness within that too. And there's so many things that we could kind of offshoot from that, but I really appreciate your time. I feel like we've been talking for a long time. Are you feeling okay? Are you?
Yeah, I'm feeling good. Yeah.